Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Nancy Kidd, the Executive Director of the National Communication Association. On behalf of our nearly 8,000 members, I'm pleased to welcome you to this discussion. Whether you're here with us in Washington or viewing this program on YouTube, we're glad you've decided to join us to explore this topic of citizenship in American society. A core component of the National Communication Association's mission is to facilitate the dissemination of disciplinary and interdisciplinary scholarship to a public audience. During this complex and sometimes confusing moment in our nation's history, we're in the crucible of an intense presidential election campaign, which is highlighting questions about the nature of citizenship. We're facing terrorist attacks around the world related to notions of citizenship, as recently as this morning in Brussels. It's critically important that we take a step back to meaningfully assess the question, what does it mean to be a citizen in contemporary America? And that's what we aim to do in hosting this conversation. It's fitting that we've partnered with Busboys and Poets for this event. Busboys and Poets is a Washington, D.C. landmark committed to creating a space for community and deliberation, a space for art, culture, and politics to intentionally collide. I'd like to thank Busboys and Poets for their hospitality and for their belief in inspiring social change and transforming our community. Once again, thank you for joining us this evening and for engaging in this important discussion. I'd like to now introduce the National Communication Association's Director of Academic and Professional Affairs, Dr. Trevor Parry-Giles, who will moderate this evening's discussion.
Thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to work with all of you and Busboys and Poets to come to a greater and we hope keener understanding of what citizenship means in the United States. In his 2016 State of the Union address, President Barack Obama invited all Americans to consider 4 pivotal questions for the future. Questions about our economy, about climate change and technology, and about America's place in the world. His final question that he asked us to consider looked inward and basically suggested that we ponder how can we make our politics reflect what's best in us and not what's worst. How can Americans repair the basic bonds of trust so necessary for a thriving, healthy, productive democracy? The President asked us. With this question and some of the answers he provided, President Obama was asking Americans to consider the question we've asked here tonight. What does it mean to be a citizen in contemporary America? We've brought together this evening a group of people who think about and seek answers to these issues about citizenship every day of their lives. As scholars who study communication and politics, American studies and rhetoric, we are all interested in the state of our politics and the meaning of citizenship in the United States. Moving beyond narrower statutory or constitutional meanings of citizenship, we seek to examine what it actually really means to be a citizen in the United States. What citizens can do to make our politics reflect what's best in us, and how to create a sense of citizenship based in trust, in faith, and in integrity. So let me introduce our guests. Elisabeth Anker, is an associate professor of American Studies at George Washington University. Among other work, exploring the constructions of citizenship and politics as shaped by key historical moments, she is the author of the provocatively titled Orgies of Feeling, Melodrama and the Politics of Freedom. Robert Asen is professor of communication arts at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He is the author and editor of several books addressing persistent problems of public policy rhetoric, most recently Democracy, Deliberation, and Education. You guys sat in order. This is amazing. Liz Markovits is an associate professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College and is the author of several important investigations into the nature and scope of political deliberation in the United States, including her book, The Politics of Sincerity, Frank Speech, Plato, and Democratic Judgment. And Eric King Watts is an associate professor of communication at the University of North Carolina, where he is committed to the amplification of voice and diversity within the broader American democracy. He is the author of Hearing the Hurt, Rhetoric, Aesthetics, and Ethics in the New Negro Movement. So our goal with this conversation is to produce some stimulating, we hope, honest dialogue about what it means to be a citizen in the contemporary United States. And I'm really hopeful that you'll all join the conversation think about some questions and comments that you might have. We'll open it up after we talk for a little bit. And if you're watching us remotely or even here in the room, join us on Twitter, hashtag NCA Conversations. That's NCA Conversations.
If America is not exceptional anymore, if the American dream is dead, then the only way to rebuild it is to regenerate it through violence.
Right.
And that's a very normal, historical narrative endpoint to that kind of melodramatic narrative. And that's what frightens me about part of what you're saying.
Donald Trump. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about that is where other melodramas might position the citizenry as both the victim and the hero, right? A citizenry that has been injured but that can rescue itself, right? For Trump, he's positioning himself as the rescuer, right? So he is the hero who will come in and, and part of what he imagines saving the day will be is that, right, part of what he tells his audience is that people will get to be him, right? And that he kind of, the kind of, self-sufficient individual hero who's not afraid to use violence, as he tells us in his speeches all the time, right? Who's self-making, strong and obstinate. And so he's cultivating a kind of model of citizenship that's based on his persona.
Do you think there's something about the way we campaign at the presidential level especially that gives rise to that kind of savior-hero narrative within that melodramatic frame? I've been troubled by the ways in which I think Trump certainly has hijacked what the presidency actually is to sort of advance this kind of heroic savior idea. I'm wondering if there's something endemic to the ways in which we campaign that bring that out.
I do think there's a way, there are scholars who have looked at melodrama and argue that it's the most popular kind of narrative of popular culture. That there's so many ways in pop culture and politics that we come to understand it. And I think we can certainly say it saturates presidential campaigns. I mean, what was interesting about Obama, of course, is that he was no drama Obama. I mean, we were, part of what people were captivated by in him was his claim to kind of de-escalate a lot of the histrionics and the rhetoric that we've seen from other presidential candidates. Although his campaign was based on that in part, his politics, he's certainly drawn on melodrama to legitimate things like the Affordable Care Act or his policies against ISIS. So it kind of goes in both directions.
And I think, there's what I think is sort of common across the sense of melodrama, and in particular to the moment, is the affective component.
Yes.
So, Trump would not be as successful as he is if what he was saying didn't resonate.
Right.
And part of the reason why what he says resonates is that people feel anxious, right? Even as we've recovered from the Great Recession of, 6 years ago, people haven't recovered. Maybe the economy as a whole has recovered, but it's still the case that as productivity goes up, wages remain stagnant. So most people haven't seen a recovery, so there's a great sense of anxiety. And that produces a certain kind of resentment. And I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Jeremy Angles at Penn State, who has a book by that title, and also Kathy Kramer at my university has a book by that title. But what Trump, I think, does incredibly well is he's able to channel resentment in particular kinds of ways, and I think this is the affective component that melodrama also draws out as well, is to take people's anxiety, to take people's anger, and to direct them, right? Whether it's immigration, whether it's religion, whether it's bad deals, and Trump is the ultimate deal maker. His claim to the presidency is he's going to cut better deals.
Right.
So I think that affective component, the sense of resentment, which he so deftly channels, I think also explains Trump's rise.
Well, it took us just a few minutes to go down the Trump road. And I'm wondering what that tells us about, circling back, the nature of citizenship, right? What does Trump's position there in our contemporary campaign indicate to us not so much about him, but about us and about the citizenry as a whole? I mean, what is it projecting out to us about citizenship? I don't know.
But I would say there's one thing I got from, I've been reading Libby's book lately, so I've been thinking about it a lot, and you have this great part where you talk about how melodrama, I think in a lot of conversations about freedom and citizenship, we wonder, are people just like that? Are people just craving this type of strong hero? But in fact, there are certain discourses that have been constructing us as certain types of citizens, right? And we're at this moment where we have, I've heard people talking about, we've watched Donald Trump on TV all these years. We've become accustomed to this. We've been through these particular political moments. There are these different things that have been going on that have sort of set the stage for us to crave this type of person. And I think there's a sort of abdication of responsibility to one's fellow citizens. It's great that the strong man figure takes control of things, and it's no longer on me in some ways. And since the world's really scary right now, there's something to that. And people have been disempowered in all these other ways. I'm used to not having a say in this venue, in this venue, in this venue, beyond diet or regular.
Right. No,
And so it's not that surprising to me that that happens, but that also leaves room for a lot of change, right? Because this has been constructed and created because of our discourses.
I mean, I will say, I think we make a mistake, though, if we focus on someone like Trump as indicative of a larger political climate, because it centralizes our sense of what our politics are and what our sense of citizenship is. And I said this briefly, I didn't develop it, but I think actually we need to go in the opposite direction. That if we're to push back against this market model which so shapes and orients our life today, that the answers aren't going to come from a presidential candidate savior, although as you astutely note, we look for these heroic figures. The answers are going to come in local communities. That's where change is going to happen. And I think, I was saying this to Eric before our meeting here, to me, the perfect example of that is Black Lives Matter. This is a series of networked locales, right? Black Lives Matter is not a top-down movement. There is no king figure who speaks for Black Lives Matter. It is rather a series of local communities that have some kind of loose affiliation. And that, to me, is probably one of the most prominent examples of a non-market engagement of politics. A claim that there is something that we are all in together. That regardless of who you are, whether you are likely to be profiled and suffer violence at the hands of police or not, this implicates you. And to me, that is where citizenship is at, if I might use that expression, today. Not someone like Trump, who, as I said, is a master at channeling resentment. But if we're going to look at sort of where citizenship lives, I think it lives in our local communities, and I think we need to find examples out there, and Black Lives Matter to me is a terrific example.
I'm wondering how that relates to Eric's arguments about voice and voicelessness, in particular when we think not necessarily of Black Lives Matter, but of the Occupy movement, right? Which I think has the same kind of energy that you're talking about, but ultimately kind of maybe, arguably, didn't go anywhere. And so I'm wondering how that relates to what you've said about voice and voicelessness, and how all of that works within the larger senses of how we understand citizenship.
Well, given what's been said, let me say something briefly about how I conceive of voice and voicelessness given the conversation. Part of what I was trying to make an argument about the production of voice is that it's not emanating from a particular body. It's not the capacity of a particular body. It's the capacity of a public to endow the affective and ethical stakes in speaking, or the affective and ethical stakes in producing discursively a notion of citizen. And so part of what Rob was arguing in terms of the market model, market models produce voicelessness. Market models tell you what you ought to say and how you ought to think and who you ought to relate to and in what particular ways. And they sell it to you through these affective registers of consumption that make you feel good about taking up this other kind of speech that is actually a kind of voicelessness. And so part of my argument regarding voice and voicelessness is that it has a paradoxical relationship to citizen. On the one hand, citizens, the notion of citizen needs some kind of stability, some sort of consensus around which we may build a model of public good that the citizen relates to. On the other hand, the production of citizenship always excludes, always puts somebody on the margin, always makes somebody voiceless. So voice emanating out of the production of citizen makes citizenship itself a site of struggle. But state-sponsored notions of citizenship don't want it to be a site of struggle. They want it to be a site of uniform consensus. And so part of my argument regarding the relationship with Trump and Black Lives Matter would be that Trump rallies are a remarkable phenomenon. Not Trump himself, but the rallies are a remarkable phenomenon in this sense. They stage a space where, as David Frum has said recently, and David Brooks has said recently, where there are these disaffected white lower class, working class, and some middle class, fairly sometimes only high school educated, but sometimes college educated, find themselves able to connect with a voice that resonates with the voice that they've always wanted to have heard in the GOP. But since the GOP have become basically a plutocracy, their voices have been marginalized within the only found political regime that they thought was speaking on their behalf. And so one of the things that's interesting about the Trump rally is that it also produces this kind of voice for them. And I argue all the time that it's a voice we have to pay attention to. It's a voice that we have to turn toward and actually acknowledge over and over again, precisely because the affective intensities and qualities of that voice have to be understood. We can't dismiss it as crazy or delusional or hate. It can't be. We can't dismiss it under those terms, even if we think it is that. It has to be engaged as a humanistic encounter with someone who has something to say and feels that they count. To them, they feel like their citizenship is being diminished over and over and over again. At the same time, Black Lives Matter interrupts those rallies and argues basically that the citizenship that you feel is being diminished is always already denied to the point of death elsewhere. And therefore, we actually have something in common if we can actually have an encounter of our voices. Precisely because we're both talking about life and death and diminishment associated with forms of citizenship. The problem with Trump, as has already been said, is that he channels it in a particular direction, a direction that is violent, that pursues hate, and that wants to, as a solution, further alienate and deny modes of citizenship. Birthright citizenship even.
That's interesting. Because in a way, you're positing a relationship between the Trump rally attendees and the protesters. And the question in most of the news media coverage of all of this is, what's Trump's role in all of that? And that's fascinating. I'm wondering then, from that, how we engage questions of sincerity and authenticity when we talk about all of this, right? Because for better or worse, and again, we're still on the Trump superhighway.
Takes up all the air.
He is perceived, maybe not sincere, but certainly authentic.
That's
or at least oddly authentic. And Liz, you've written about some of this, and I'm wondering how you read the role of the citizen engaging and assessing all of that created authenticity, I think.
Well, I think picking up on Eric's thread too, if you think about, I keep going back to last summer when someone first asked me, what about, it was someone in, I think the BBC, what's this Trump guy all about? And I thought, okay, well, let me go pay more attention to what I've been hearing. And I'm reading stuff he's saying, and it always struck me when the first things on the real national stage they talked about was how he owns all the politicians, right? They come to me, and so he points out the plutocracy. Right? And he starts talking about that. And he's not a socialist talking about it, right? So, I mean, people have been talking about it in the US. He's not a leftist academic like these people have, he's not, right? And he points out that the game is rigged to all these people who feel like they've been screwed, right? They didn't get what they want. And a lot of them are white men who feel, there's a different, I'm used to not getting what I want as a woman who's now a mother. I mean, there are all sorts of ways I'm told I don't deserve it, right? I mean, lots of people experience marginalization, right? But there is a narrative, right, in American culture that the cleaver dad, right? You should be able to provide for your family, you should have all this. and that's been taken away. And people have been documenting this for a long time. So I think about Susan Faludi's work, all sorts of people, right? And so these people hear this, and there's this truth there that they hear. And maybe he's not sincere in it. I mean, he is one of those people who's buying politicians, as he admits, but he admits this, and he says it out loud, and it comes across as someone's finally exposing what this game is, and people are really attracted to that. And he merges a couple things. So he has this bit that resonates with people really deeply. He does have this realist tone to him. When I talk about, I call it hypersincerity, and I talk about merging this realist tone, that Robert Harriman's work, if you want to know more about it, it's a great book, with a cult of plain speech, right? And so you have very simple language. There's a great video on YouTube today dissecting, did anyone see this? Dissecting Trump's reading level. So it's about at a 4th grade reading level. It's the lowest of any of the candidates.
And I think his spoken language is at a 3rd grade reading level, though Cruz is at 6th grade.
Yeah.
I mean, Clinton's at 6th grade. You know, that's,
He's really there's a visualization of the words in a speech, and it's great. And the way he ends his speeches,
Believe me.
super interesting. And so it's very simple speech. And he mentions the word, there's a problem. He's always talking about the problem, and he's here to fix it. Short on details, but they're going to be tremendous, right? He's studied it more than anyone ever has. Keep saying that. Not aware as ultimate study, right? And so it's very plain English, coupled with this viewpoint that he can see there's one solution, and it's clear to him, right? He is the person himself. He doesn't need all these fancy advisors. Right? He doesn't need the fancy foreign policy big wigs. He's got some people on it, but don't worry, he's studied it more closely than anyone else. And he's not going to pander to you, which is a sure sign that someone might be starting to pander. But that's how he led his APAC speech yesterday, right? So he's not going to pander. He's not going to use experts and those lefty intellectuals. And he's going to tell it to you like it is in really simple terms that we can all understand. And that, I think, is very persuasive to people and it's been persuasive for a long time, not because there's something deep in humanity that needs it, I'm not sure why. I mean, I study it in the context of Athenian democracy, and we had people who spoke like that then, or recorded as speaking like that then. And so he becomes, I think, very persuasive to us in this time of insecurity where we want someone who knows what they're doing. And this savior figure again.
I'm interested in the impact of that on the local sorts of citizens that, Robert, you've been talking about, right? Because when the news media go out and find a Trump supporter and interview them at a Trump rally or someplace else, it's fascinating to me the way they perform their citizenship to explain away, by virtue of his sincerity or frank speech, to explain away problems that they might have with the candidate. You know, and that seems to me to put that particular citizen in an interesting position.
Well, so I would say he's really deactivating for citizens, right? Because you don't need to get involved. You just need to vote for him, support him, lead him to the presidency, because he's going to take care of everything. Because there's no reason for deliberation, there's no reason for discussion, there's no real conflict. They're just bad people, as he calls the protesters at his rallies. Those are bad people. We're going to get them out of here. We're going to take our country back from them. Conflict for Trump does not come from reasonable disagreements that we might have or different perspectives. It comes from bad people.
Right. It's a visceral and bodily antagonism that he plays upon, which disactivates the deliberative democracy of citizenship. Is to be a citizen is to point out those who are undeserving, and then they become the object of ridicule, hostility, scorn, and rejection. That act of citizenship shores up your own right to the citizenship that he's claiming he's going to give you. And so there's a dynamic relationship that I think is very dangerous there regarding how to enact discursively and performatively your citizenship. You call other people non-citizens or unpatriotic or un-American or not really American. You build the wall and you exclude others from path to citizenship. You take away birthright citizenship. And all of that is supposed to shore up my claims to both the materiality of a citizenship that is being diminished now, but also make me feel better as an active citizen. I mean, part of what I see going on, and I've watched at least 8 or 9 Trump rallies.
You are a glutton for punishment.
Yeah.
Yeoman service.
And part of what I'm seeing here in terms of the performance of a voice there is not that the voice is the pre-discursive moment to an argument. It's the vocalization itself that matters. It's the expression of I'm pissed off that matters in this space supporting that guy. And then sometimes it spills over into a violent act against the protester who is not American at that moment, who doesn't deserve the rights and protections of the police at that moment. They deserve, in fact, the police action that Black Lives Matter is protesting at that moment. I mean, and so that's why I say we need to get past that fusion so that the voices themselves can encounter each other rather than the voices being permanently locked into an antagonistic relation, which is what Trump wants to. And by the way, the mainstream media just replicates that. Just consistently replicates this is an antagonistic moment, a conflict, rather than something that, hey, you know what? There is a commonality that's going on here that gets displaced by the violence.
Well, one way to think about it is also what is the role of violence. I mean, I think there's a way in these rallies that the performing violence against protesters is a form of citizenship.
Right.
It's almost like the highest form of citizenship,
exactly
right? Because you're proving kind of your loyalty or your commitment in a certain way. So that any form of protest or dissent is also considered non-citizenship, right? There's a deep sense of loyalty that's being constructed there.
And he'll cover your legal fees.
Right.
Yeah.
But of course, for all of these candidates, for any presidential campaign, part of what they're trying to do is to generate what they want you to do, which is to vote for them. So much of citizenship in any presidential campaign is going to be about making sure that you vote for this candidate. So many candidates, and I think especially for candidates who are more grassroots, someone like Bernie Sanders, there's a bit of a conflict in the sense that part of what he's hoping to do is to galvanize people to vote for him, and that act of voting becomes the crucial, most important act.
Right.
And yet, at the same time, part of the message is that all these people have been disenfranchised and that they need to get involved and to construct an understanding of citizenship that's not about violence, but that's about much more a kind of deep participation, a participation that can happen through government, that can happen at a role of civil disobedience, which he certainly sees and has performed himself as a practice of citizenship. Right, but then how do you, reconciling things like dissent, protest, disobedience, as well as participation, thick participation in government, with also that act of voting, right, is a challenge. They're different practices of citizenship, one much more engaged than the other.
Right.
And
I guess, again, I would say, I think we make a mistake if we focus on Trump as a unique phenomenon, right? There were Trumps 10 years ago. There were Trumps 20 years ago. There were Trumps 30, 40 years ago. The question isn't how on earth has Trump managed to do these things? The key question is why are those things resonating now?
Right.
And the answer to that isn't about this one unique figure who came out of nowhere and figured all of this out. The answer is that we have laid the groundwork in our politics over this long time. So a politics of resentment works because we've already divided ourselves, because we've already lost faith in the idea of a public good, because we already are inclined to think in individualistic terms, which is what the market invites us, as Eric was suggesting, to do. Because George W. Bush said the response to the 9/11 tax was to go shopping. When that's your politics, a politics of resentment has plenty of room to maneuver. What does it mean for local communities? Absolutely. I think for people who are at Trump rallies, they are enacting citizenship through their violence because they're being good patriots. There is a potential connection. I think what ties all of this together is a kind of anger. The Bernie bros are motivated by anger, right? The Trump folks are motivated by anger. The question is, what do you do with this? How does it become productive? And that's the difference between a politics of resentment and incitement to violence on the one hand, and an effort to remake community on the other. And that's why we have to look at local communities, and not just Black Lives Matter, although certainly that's the most successful example of a networked set of local communities. But in Wisconsin, there are folks all over the state on education, for example, who are pushing back, right? Who are saying, we want our public schools, and we want our public schools to be the center of our community. And those citizens are grassroots as they come, right? It's people who've simply started their own communities and try to push back. Now, the legislature hasn't listened, but of course they haven't listened, because this is a larger phenomenon.
Right.
But if there's going to be a change, it's not going to be by someone, Bernie, being elected president and changing all of the local communities in America. It's got to happen the other way, right? It's got to be local communities continuing to push back when they can to make change, and to take up some of this energy and say, look, man, I know you're anxious, but it's not the immigrant who threatens you. And hating immigrants isn't going to make your life better. But who's going to say that? David Brooks? Right? Are people in local communities going to read a David Brooks column and say, oh my God, he's right, I've been wrong? No. Right? It's going to be your neighbor. It's going to be somebody engaging you at the local level.
So I think Robert begins the conversation that I want to have before we open it up to all of you and get all of your questions and input and dialogue going. But I was going to ask everybody up here to, for about 45 seconds or so, much akin to what Robert just did, talk about what you think is the most important element or factor going forward when we think about citizenship in the United States. Right? And I get from Robert that it's at that local level, neighbor talking to neighbor, making that kind of change, right?
Can I add one thing to that?
Of course.
It has to be relationships. It can't be local as such. It has to be locals relating to other locals. It has to be a network. Right?
Do you want to go with your 45 seconds?
Sure. So I would say, I think the most important aspect of citizenship today, and probably in general, is the sense of that there is always going to be a constant tension between the people and between institutions and people who are in power. And I think that relationship always has to be somewhat antagonistic, by which I mean even agonistic. There always has to be that tension there. It's always the role of the people to be in a position of critique, of challenge, of dissent. Of course, if there are policies that you support, to show that form of support. But in general, I think claims that citizenship are always only about loyalty and fealty oftentimes can be quite undemocratic. So that.
I keep changing what I'm thinking as I listen, which is a good sign. But I'll go back to what I was thinking originally, which is, so I think, and this has come out of some work I've been looking at lately, some of which is Libby's, as I mentioned, is think about the relationship between control and interdependence or vulnerability, right? And I think we see a lot of that coming out with this election, with how people feel, and assertions of we are interdependent. What your police force is doing has deep effects on my life. What you are doing here does affect me. And there's this desire many people have, because the promises of freedom in the United States have been sort of misguided in a lot of ways, that freedom means being able to control my life, to make all my own choices, to be king of my castle. Right, and we really have to get beyond that sense of freedom to a more intersubjective, but a sense of bonds and interdependence with the other citizens. It's about relationships once again. Yeah.
Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Seems appropriate.
I mean, just think about the person in control of everything, right? I have everything, and I'm not going to lose it because I'm stronger than you.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I would say that somehow we need to produce a pro-social form of citizenship, where the citizen and the obligations associated with that notion is always directed toward building a better community, society, school system, economic base, beginning locally and then regionally, and that it doesn't begin and end with a specific set of rights that I feel that protect me on a day-to-day basis. That it has to be about a set of obligations to others that remake in every act and in every conversation, in every town hall meeting, that remake that there is a common bound underneath the notion of citizen, that if we have that erode totally, then citizenship means virtually nothing in terms of its classical sense. It gets basically reduced to consumption or to consumer, right, or to a particular act, vote.
So now we're interested in what you all have to think. We've heard about markets, we've heard about melodramas, sincerity, authenticity, voicelessness, all of these topics swirling around what it means to be a citizen in the United States. But that's great coming from all of us. We're interested in what you have to say. We've discovered that we may not be able to count on live streaming Twitter-generated questions. So it's up to you all to indicate to us what you think are important topics or concerns about citizenship in America. And Jacqueline here will have a microphone, so go to it. Yay, Anne.
Hi, so very stimulating discussion. A couple of things that just again what you were talking about.
I don't think your mic's on.
Hello? Hello?
Now it's on.
There you go.
Okay, so I think that the under-theorized part of your discussion, but it was starting to come out at the end, was really what was going on sociologically. And so, when you were talking about, I started thinking about Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. I mean, how do you build that social connection? And it seems to me that there has been lots of trends that have led us towards what I would say citizenship as spectator sport, much more so than participatory. And then some of our institutions like labor union, even political parties, etc., have gone through profound kind of reduction or degradation. And so I think that's probably one of the kind of pessimistic part of how we will rebuild. And I think Black Lives Matter is great, but I think about the Arab Spring and the sort of tremendous energy that was generated around that. But unless you scale it up, and then especially if you to stand up to those very, very powerful institutions, whether they're market-driven or whether they're, a state that's very, that part, I don't know. I mean, I'm a optimistic person by nature, but I just don't quite see how we rebuild that. And I'm sorry, this sounds like a very old-fashioned kind of soapbox, but I think that our technologies, internet and all, I think it's further fragmenting us. And again, we think that if we just share an article about something that, anti-Trump, that is our act of citizenship, right? And so I think that those are the kinds of, so the actual getting out there and getting, and getting engaged in your communities, that I think is becoming, is not as.
I guess I certainly share your cynicism, but I'm skeptical of calls to find models that we can scale up. I think I'm skeptical of sort of macro level thinking about this to begin with. The idea that there is a response to the forces that we've talked about, to me, seems unrealistic. The way that people get involved, the way that ordinary folks get involved, is something in their life bugs them. And it bugs them enough that they're prepared to do something about it. I think a politics of resentment suggests that doing something about it can go in different directions. But ultimately, I think that's where it starts. And so it has to be people in their everyday lives rallying together to say, this bugs me, this bugs us, what are we going to do about it? At the same time, we have to recognize this is an uphill climb, because for 30-some years, we have lived in a culture that has argued against that has argued that you can only count on you, right? Mm-hmm. The individual, we will give you the decision, the information you need to make good decisions. That's how you can count on it. You can't count on public agencies, you can't count on community. Those things are fiction, right? Milton Friedman's vision, he wrote it in 1962, started to come to life in the 70s and 80s, and we see it now. So it's an uphill climb, but the only way that I think starts to reverse itself is the same way that this uphill climb began, by people in local communities engaging and saying, this bugs us and we're going to do something about it.
I want to add to that, because as you're talking, yes. But I was thinking about a discussion between some people, I know this is just on Facebook, but illustrates my point. So we're about to have a school committee election in the town I live in, Amherst, Massachusetts, and there's a lot going on. We're maybe consolidating the schools, very contentious. And there are 3 candidates running. And someone was saying, well, why don't you run, to someone else? And I was asked last week, why don't you run? And I'm thinking about my workload, right? And I have a pretty privileged job, I'll say here, right, where I have some flexibility. I'm not clocking in at a particular time. I only have one job, right? I think about the ways in which I control my time to a degree that many people in this country do not at this point. And people being asked to run for school committee, where am I going to get the time? How am I going to do that? So I think we always have to keep the local involvement in mind, and I want to privilege that, but also we have to tackle questions like income inequality and the state of workers in this country. And I do think there is a space on the macro level for that, because giving people time to have their lives, to make enough money, to eat, to pay their rent, and to have that involvement, something has to change, because there are too many people working crazy and irregular hours, right? People whose schedule gets changed all the time. I mean, we'll start talking about basic income now, but that's probably a different panel, but there's something.
Absolutely, and I don't want to dismiss institutional politics. What I'm skeptical of is macro level planning of a social movement. What I'm skeptical is macro level planning of engaged citizenry. Those aren't macro level things. But is there a place for institutional politics? Of course there is. If we had policymakers who would address income inequality, would those kinds of structural things change? Of course. And all of these things are related. So individualism feeds our sense of institutions. It reshapes institutions, which then reinforces individualism. Vouchers in education is a perfect example. If you attack public education, you change structure in a way that reinforces this cultural idea that it is the individual, not community, just the individual who can act. So of course these things are related. Absolutely.
And one thing I would also add to that is, I also agree in the level of participation that I think is so important for citizenship. It so often happens at the local level because so many of our concerns are localized and specific. But I also think having a macro level, imaginary about, what are we fighting for? Who are we connected to? This question of connection again. Thinking of ourselves as interconnected at a national, at a transnational level. I think being able to have those kinds of larger sense of what the commons is rather than only the local is incredibly important, because I think part of some of the changes that we can attribute to neoliberalism and other factors is this radical diminishment of the commons, of what we care about in public life, of how we're invested in each other, and of even our understandings of that we're connected, right? So that rather than being the hyper-individualized, I only care about myself and my immediate priorities, especially when we get to issues like climate change, which are not, that don't know borders, we kind of need to have these much larger sense of how we're connected to other people, to other communities, and why we are, because I think so many of our large issues have to be solved at that level.
Yeah, I take seriously your comment about pessimism, and it has something to do with what just come up with Libby, and that's understanding these relationships. One of the things that fuels pessimism is the obfuscation of the relationships that reproduce things like income inequality, that reproduce a disaffected white male, wherein his attention turns toward the border rather than a plutocratic class that has shipped his jobs across the border. And all of those mechanisms are not accidentally complex. They're so hard to understand. And so part of the question, that I would like us to take up and to think about is that, one, our mainstream nor our localized partisan radio and television helps to unpack these complex relationships among legislation, among gerrymandering districts, among outsourcing of jobs, the production of pessimism, and how are all of those related to one another? And mapping out those relationships, I wish there was a major corporate move, although why would they do that, to map these relationships so that people actually saw them in clear terms, like they see the relationship among, the NCAA March Madness and the money that goes back to their university. At UNC, we're clear on how much money we make from March Madness. I mean, this is not a mystery, but these other things that are a lot more important, sorry UNC, are a mystery. And it's easy then to take that, it's easy then to feel the pain associated with this disaffection, this voicelessness, to understand that I'm not being heard, and then to link that to time-honored traditions of scapegoating and hate-mongering, rather than pay attention to the relationships that we have in common, that we can talk about locally, but also can mobilize institutional politics regarding educating people about these relationships that are not getting more simple, they're getting more and more complex. And one of the things that I do think the internet is good for is perhaps mobilizing an understanding of these relationships precisely because it's built upon the whole nation of relationality.
Right.
And so the structure of the internet might actually be helpful in teaching these complex relations.
And let me just say, we're only going to get to
As a starting point.
We're only going to get to one question.
question.
You ask for academics on a panel. You got to ask like somebody who's doing practice stuff. But I add one thing to it, and that's to underscore relationships. An engaged citizenry, if we want to use something like that, is a networked public.
It is.
Right? Yeah. And that's relationships. It's a big ask, if I can use sort of that sort of language, to say to someone in Flint, Michigan, let alone about their water. When you think about deindustrialization in the United States, you are a citizen of the world. Place yourself globally. That's not how we think. But what you could say, if you want to create relationships among locals, is imagine the anxiety that you feel around deindustrialization. And imagine somebody who lives in a border town on the Mexico side of the US-Mexico border, connecting locales, right? That's a network public, not we are citizens of the world. And environmentalism, same thing, right? You're drinking water. Somebody in Brazil, it faces the same situation, connecting locales. That's the networked public that we need.
Well, and so much of that is event-driven, right? So police accidentally or purposefully shoot a young African-American man in Ferguson, Missouri, and then it happens in Baltimore. There's the linkage, right? There's the commonality. Right. Okay. Other questions?
Move quicker.
Gentleman here first. One hand in the back, the other hand in the back.
Testing. Whoops. Okay, it works. So before I get to my rather involved question, if I can even get it out of my testing. Well, anyway.
We can hear you.
Okay. So my first observation is the fact that you guys, it seems to me, have all been talking from a top-down perspective. I'm not being critical. It's just that I came here thinking about the subject of citizenship from a bottom-up perspective, for what that's worth. But to the question, you guys mentioned the Trump rallies and the Occupy movement and Black Lives Matter. You didn't even mention Tea Party, interestingly enough, just an observation. These guys, all of these groups at some level are dealing with anger, which I think is, why not? Why not? I mean, that's wonderful. Don't leave your anger at home. Let's get it expressed. I mean, independent of what you want to do with it, but let's at least get it expressed and out there. And also, I think entitlement is also an area where they come from. That is to say, hey, I'm an American, I'm entitled. Just because I'm a citizen, I was born this way. I don't think there's a real, well, that gets to my question. From this bottom-up perspective, I come from the area of a citizen ought to be not just somebody who had the privilege to be born to American parents or born in this country, but ought to be somebody who's, you'll pardon the expression, to use a word that Robert used just a few minutes ago, engaged or participating in the community, whether it's the local community, the county, the state, the nation, it doesn't matter, but participating and engaged. And that other word, which I don't think anyone has mentioned at all, informed. And I'd like to toss out the question again. This is from a bottom up, not from the top down, which you guys have spent all your time talking about. I just have had at the back of my head this notion that maybe citizenship, that is to say the fact of citizenship, you were born here or born to American parents, is not enough for suffrage, that going to the voting, and certainly voting is not enough to be a citizen. You need to be more engaged than just going to the voting booth every 2 years. But I don't know if it wouldn't be worthwhile if you had to actually show that you have some level of engagement with your American community by actually, you'll pardon the expression, having to pass the same test that people who come here and become citizens have to pass, which is a citizenship test. I was wondering what you guys think about making that a requirement for suffrage.
Can I say real quick about the top-down, bottom-up? I'll let others talk about citizenship test, although I won't say anything about that. I think the one thing I think I would disagree with you about is Black Lives Matter. So it's a name that a lot of local activists have used, but it is very much a group of local activists who come together to change our community. Let me give you a quick example. So the Black Lives Matter group in my town is called Young, Gifted, and Black. YGB, sorry, just wanted to give them some respect that they deserve. And they have been incredibly active in Madison. We had our own police shooting. Tony Robinson was killed by a Madison police officer. And they organized large-scale protests and got people involved talking about racial justice in Madison. And have they won all the time? No, they haven't. But we were going to expand our county jail. We were going to either build a new county jail or effectively build a new county jail by spending $20, $30 million on our county jail. And YGB said, this is how we're going to spend $30 million. We have the achievement gaps in our local public schools are the worst in the nation on race, the worst in the nation. And so now we're going to spend $36 million on black people by imprisoning them, right? That's what we're going to do in Madison. And it's YGB, Young, Gifted, and Black, that is primarily responsible for that not happening. And that is bottom up. And that one they won. And the rest of us can thank them for the hard work that they did. So I guess you're right, the Tea Party is top down, regardless of whether they talk about grassroots. Trump is top down. But, I mean, I can give you other examples you wouldn't have heard of, but the others are bottom up.
I think you guys have discussed things from a top-down level.
Well, I might push back a little bit on that. If anything, I was sitting here listening to what I saw as a sort of tension between an interest in the top-down from a Trump sort of basis and Robert and everybody else's sense that a lot of citizenship is actually performed from the bottom up, right? That's what it means to be a citizen. And it seems to me a literacy test or an engagement test would in fact be just the opposite, a sort of top-down determination of what counts and what it means to perform citizenship at the bottom-up local level. And so that would be my sort of initial response to that. But I do think what you've highlighted is what I've seen as a very interesting tension between where the motivation and sources of citizenship come from in our contemporary time.
I just want to echo that real quick on both of those notes. I was trying to talk about how I see voice as a mode of politics that oftentimes cuts against a political regime. So voice for me is a very localized, dialogic phenomenon that cannot be orchestrated from the top down. It has to meet somewhere in the middle, and that's the mode of tension that I see operating in citizenship. The very endowment of voice has to be a meeting place between the body on the ground in a particular material space and the political regime that is trying to enter into conversation with, partake in, be counted by. So it's a very dynamic interaction between the two. Secondarily, I wouldn't trust a state, I won't mention one, but there are lots of states I wouldn't trust with such a test. Not only because history repeats itself,
Exactly.
and we're seeing history repeating itself right now with the way in which school boards are rewriting against educated folks, rewriting history, putting slavery under immigration, for example, in many high school history books, which is a localized phenomenon. And so I wouldn't trust that local phenomenon to decide on who's going to get the vote. Nor would I trust a federal mandate. So in that sense, then, I would say let's leave it the way it is, and we work it out in terms of how we educate our citizenry, which becomes a driving force of developing citizens, not the background. But part of the problem that you're pointing to, and I agree with the problem, uninformed. I agree with that problem. But what's the solution to the problem? The problem is, what, 40, 50 years in the making regarding how we educate or miseducate ourselves and our children around a whole lot of half-truths, omissions, bifurcations, taxonomic education where women's studies is in a particular space and time rather than... Right. and we can go on and on. Therefore, people can basically step around the knowledges that they don't want to be bothered with. And we have rewarded that step around. And so part of the problem, and so I'm agreeing with your basic principle. I'm disagreeing a little bit with our conversation because I saw it as a tension, a conversation about the tensions between grassroots and the political regimes that seek to exploit them, manipulate them, and have to contend with them. But lastly, I would be frightened about literacy tests of any kind regarding suffrage.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, literacy tests have so often been used in our country to exclude people from the vote, for African Americans, women, right? Often, and they've been institutionalized in that way so many times, I would be quite suspicious of it. I would also be suspicious of the way that so many modes of testing in our country have become corporatized and standardized, right? So I don't want like Pearson Education deciding,
Perfect example.
Right, who is responsible for that. So for me, if we go back to a thinker like Tocqueville, who argued that what's most important for understanding what it means to be a citizen is participating in it, right? It's not about like knowledge, it's literally about the civic engagement and getting involved, and that doesn't have to be institutionally. It can be extra politically, in terms of things like getting involved in particular movements or activism. All of those are forms of civic engagement that actually make citizenry stronger over time. And cultivating space for that kind of politics would then get back to Liz's original question about how do we, even provide for people to have this space in their lives to have the time to do things like that, right? And that to me is a much more important and fruitful path of thinking about political participation than a test.
Other questions? Jacqueline, are you?
In the back.
Yeah, in the dark sweat, he's had his hand up the whole time.
Thank you. I am a recent citizen. I come from Venezuela, okay? I was struck by you when you mentioned melodrama because I felt in a way that even the panel, and this is a positive feedback, should be more representative of Latino, Asian Pacific Islander. I see black and white. I see America 40 years ago, and I'm 50 years old. Okay, just a suggestion for next events. The other thing that struck me is, yes, I took the citizenship exam, and I'm gonna tell you something. When the person from immigration goes with you through the interview, explain you what are your rights and your duties as a new American citizen. I have to pay taxes, but I also have the duty to get involved in the political process. Okay, you guys didn't even touch that. I've been struck here hearing just how Donald Trump is becoming this evil voice for the little brown people like me with an accent. And that's a very simplistic approach. If we're gonna talk about contemporary America, show me how complex it is to become a citizen. in America right now, 21st century, after 9/11, being HIV positive, a gay man. That will be a topic of more interesting to talk about, all right? No Donald Trump. I'm not scared of Donald Trump because he's just a demagogue, okay? We cannot wait wasting time. I also be struck by you when you said that you're privileged because how am I going to get involved in my board school if I have so many jobs or I only have one job? Even if we have to juggle with 7 activities, it's our duty as new citizens to be there and participate. Because if we don't open our mouths, someone else will do it. And if I remain silent right here, no one will know how complex it is to become a citizen in this country. All right? So that's my positive feedback to you guys. Because what I see in here, and I've been like, I drink 2 cranberry juices, I'm not even drinking alcohol. And I'm going like, am I just seeing a simplistic approach of Fox News panel of political talking heads on a Sunday morning? I thought that this will be more complex on how difficult it is to become a citizen. What are the challenges of the new citizens to integrate ourselves to the American society? What is how difficult or how we overcome the American so-called melting pot? Is that a reality? How is the American dream can become an American nightmare? Those are the big question marks that no one of you has addressed here.
Do any of you want to maybe take a swing at that?
Yeah.
I would.
I'm sorry if I'm being incendiary.
No, it's fine. But
Look at him, kids.
maybe they
explode like a piñata.
That's great. Maybe they've got some answers for you.
I mean, I would accept and say, you know, making panels more diverse, making the academy more diverse, right? That's always welcome and a worthy critique and goal. So I want to grant you that, and then move on to, you know, you're saying we're not discussing the challenges, but I think that's precisely what we're doing. I think it's dangerous to dismiss someone like Donald Trump. I mean, I think given news today when he's talking about we need more torture, not less, he was on our minds coming into this. But you're right, we shouldn't let him take up all the air. But at the same time, this will have major effects on us. I was talking to Republican campaign consultants last fall who said, oh no, this isn't really going to happen, there's no way. Right? And now I am nervous. Someone was telling me a friend who works on race and children, right, about a therapist in the Bay Area who's actually seeing little kids come in. She specializes in children and trauma. Kids coming in, really worried because they hear Trump speaking on TV. They walk past a TV store. They see him. They hear this even if their parents try and protect them. And they're worried their family's going to be split up. So that is shaping these 8-year-olds' sense of whether or not they belong in this country. So I don't accept don't pay attention to Trump. Like, I think this is a really pivotal moment, and I avoided it for a long time, and now I'm really ticked off and want to talk a lot about it. Not at you, I'm ticked off about Trump. You hear go shopping, right? Go, vote, and that's the extent of citizenship. And then when you're overworked and underpaid and sick and XYZ and taking care of, women do a lot of care work for family, both younger generation and older generation. It becomes very hard. And that's why you see women without the resumes to run for office, to get more involved. They've been working too much to do other things. So that's my little soapbox. But I think to understand why people aren't involved, we have to pay attention to the structural factors.
I agree with almost everything you said. As a person who studies voice and voicelessness, it's precisely the dynamic that you pointed to that said your perspective was voiceless here that resonates with me, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't have your perspective. A colleague of mine, Tina Medell, does study that very kind of thing, and if she were here, you wouldn't have been saying what you just said because she would have been speaking to it directly, but somebody else in the room may have had their perspective not articulated and would have said something similar. That is the structural limitation of this event and of the academy, as we've just said. But I agree with you. I mean, that kind of experience, what I want to do is be able to translate the intensity that you just expressed regarding the obligations of citizenship across generations and across lines. That's what I want to be able to do. That's why I'm so upset about the way in which citizenship is so tangled to state-sponsored rights. And even though you're leaning on those state-sponsored rights, you're not held back by them. Your motivation is beyond that, and it's clear that it is. What I'm trying to get at is how do we replicate that kind of motivation and pass it on to other generations to share it in the forums where we work, which is generally the academy, to students who come in rather apathetic sometimes about the obligations that you're intensely committed to. How do we make that translation? Is my question. But I agree with almost everything you said, except for the resemblance to Fox News. I take
I'm pretty sure that's pretty accurate.
Precisely because I criticize all of those forums.
Fuck you to see.
We resemble that.
If I appreciate this, I want to thank you, really, because positive feedback, thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Let's get a couple more questions.
Hi. Actually, just to the point we were just talking about, and a lot of the things we've talked about tonight about individualism and then voting, but then also obligations, I'd be really interested to hear what your opinions are on voter ID laws, because we have this idea that we're saying, everyone who's legally authorized needs to go out and vote. It's their obligation, and it's their obligation to educate themselves so when they make that choice in the polling booth, it's a good one and it's reasonable for their beliefs, et cetera. But at the same time, we have states that are creating impossibilities. North Carolina, for instance, is one of them that has a lot of new obstacles in place to prevent people who are otherwise legally authorized to vote from doing so. And I'm wondering how that fits into the idea that citizenship, one of the main ways in this country, at least, that we perform citizenship is by voting, and we have such an obligation to do so.
Yeah. Can I jump briefly? Because you just mentioned something where my spouse and I are president and vice president of the Democratic district in which we live. One of the ways in which we're trying to get the enthusiasm that the gentleman there expressed a moment ago regarding the obligations of citizenship is to go into high schools and teach the new voter registration laws, and to get them to turn around and teach to others, right? To actually hold workshops about how you can do this as class projects, as senior projects, as civic engagement in your own neighborhoods, and things of this nature. And it's one of the things that young people have really gravitated toward in our in my world, wherein once you explain to them the reason that they're not able, at least in North Carolina anymore, are not able to register as a high school senior is because of these new voter laws. And then you have to, and then you pass out this information, and you say you can just talk about it with your friends and other Boy Scouts, whatever group your fraternities, sororities, whatever group you're plugging into. Do the obligation of talking this up, and you are performing a kind of citizenship. And it's the habit. One of the things that I've noticed is that if you habituate this kind of thing in people younger, then they see it not as something foreign to their everyday practice. They become, they immerse themselves in the subjectivity of a kind of citizenship. Mm-hmm. I've seen it in my own son, who's one of the laziest boys I've ever met. and so part of the question is what motivates him? What motivates him is a mode of performance where it's not just about him. Mm-hmm. That's literally what motivates him.
Mm-hmm. He's a kid.
Right.
Another way I think we could think about it is I think voter ID laws are incredibly anti-democratic because all they're doing is limiting, who can vote, right? And of course it's on party lines, it's on racial lines, right? It's on economic lines. And so, it's kind of almost doubly sad when we go back to thinking about how the role of citizenship has changed and become this market model, and there's so many less venues. Voting seems to be one place that people still recognize as a form of participation, and then even that gets truncated even further. There are even, I am all for proliferating as many people voting as possible, including non-citizens, people who live here and are affected by US policies. I mean, there have even been arguments in other countries that US foreign policy for so many different countries dictates so many of the terms of their own internal politics that they should have a right to vote in the US presidency and in national politics. I'm not adverse to that.
Well, I'm an election judge in Montgomery County, Maryland. And one of the things that I saw in our last training session was that we've now gone to paper ballots. And it's in reaction to the election in 2000. It took them that long to implement paper ballots, right? But it's a reaction to the ownership or market forces behind Diebold, which controls the touchscreen technology of, so it really is at that local level. And I think what Eric says about habituation, right? Creating habits of citizenship would be an interesting way to think about a bottom-up perspective of civic engagement and civic training.
I think as you're talking about this, I'm thinking Abby, who asked the question, went to Mount Holyoke, where I came with one of my students, and so shout out to Mount Holyoke. But we thinking about college campuses this past year, right? There's all this anxiety about free speech being threatened on college campuses, and the way I just put that makes it clear what I think about that argument unfairly. But there's this idea that students are sort of out of control, right? And they're protesting everything, and we can't do anything. The amazing thing is, that I see from my perspective, is this habituation. They're mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore, right? They have grievances, legitimate grievances, and they're making them known. And for many of us who, the faculty and administration at those colleges, we're maybe not quite used to that. We're maybe used to a more passive student body in some ways. And I find it really thrilling to hear. I'm going to regret this when next time I'm faced with some criticism by students, but I find it very thrilling to have our students coming up and pushing back and saying, no, this is our space, we want it, and we have a problem with this. And so I'm inspired by certain things I see, Black Lives Matter, the student activism on campus, which is related to that. At Mount Holyoke, it started with the Mo Honest campaign a couple years ago and has really picked up. And it's pretty amazing to see, and gives me some optimism even in the face of horrible headlines today and for the last couple weeks.
Let me add one thing to that and say, I don't know if this is counterintuitive or not, but I think that voter ID laws and other efforts to restrict voting, because as Libby said, that's clearly what they are perfectly aligned with a market model of citizenship. And here's why. Because any kind of citizenship is not equally accessible to all, right? Citizenship is never an abstract that we can all participate on equal terms. Liz mentioned earlier the invisible work that women do, right? So in all kinds of realms. So when we think about sort of how we talk about market actors, you have freedom, you can make your choices, you can make the world you want. Well, I mean, that positions certain kinds of people, mostly white men, right? People who are outside of the domestic sphere of labor, don't have those kinds of entailments. People who are don't have to worry about being profiled by cops. And so it claims a universality that it never possesses, right? And so what we see effectively is a kind of privilege. So yes, we will give you vouchers and you can send your child anywhere. Well, who really can send their child anywhere, right? Or who can produce the kinds of IDs that these voter ID laws are requiring? The very same people who are entirely comfortable with the idea that political engagement is voting and giving money, right? I'm going to make my voice heard because I'm going to donate a lot of money to the candidate who represents me. So I think that's perfectly consistent. It's of a piece. It is the sort of backwards filling in of this supposedly abstract universal subjectivity. But this is why I think the relationship between institutional politics on the one hand and people's everyday sense of engagement has to be made a relationship. Because the institution is constricting. So people have to push back outside the institution to make it expand.
And that in and of itself may function as somewhat satisfactory beginning to the answer that President Obama, to the question that President Obama posed, which is how do we make our politics better? And how do we make it reflect the best of us and not the worst? And I really want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and engaging in this meaningful and interesting discussion, and especially our Fox News panel here on the stage for joining us here at Busboys and Poets. And please be safe, be a citizen, and enjoy the rest of your evening.